Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session More Food and Better Food. I am Matthew Hills from the Norwich Research Park in the UK, which is the partner with BioVision for this session. And if you would permit me some shameless advertising, we have partnered with BioVision because we have a lot of world-leading research in this area in Norwich, both on the fundamental science and its applications, and particularly in plant genetics at the John Innes Centre, where Kathy Martin, our third speaker, runs her lab. We also have the Sainsbury Laboratory, which focuses on plant diseases, and the Genome Analysis Centre, which focuses on the genomics of plants, crops in the main, farm animals and microbes from environmental systems as well as involved in human health. We also have a major strength in food sciences, nutrition and health, which is based at the Institute of Food Research, together with colleagues at the Norwich Medical School at the University of East Anglia, and with colleagues of theirs in biological sciences, pharmacy, and clinicians at the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital, where it's a major research and teaching hospital in the region. Overall, the UK has 8 government-funded life science institutes, and we have 3 of those in Norwich, so we're quite significant in the UK. And acknowledging this strength in research, just last week the UK government announced its intention to invest €30 million into Norwich Research Park to support the innovation and enterprise, and we're seeking partners, so please do. I strongly encourage you to visit the Norwich Research Park stand, which is downstairs near the lunch and coffee room. Now, the session More Food and Better Food comes at an appropriate moment after lunch, and I would say particularly in Lyon and the surrounding region, which is home, I'm sure many here would argue, is the pinnacle of world's gastronomy. And I've had several very nice meals here already myself to attest to that. But we must consider that for the world at large, food is becoming an ever more important topic. The Food and Agriculture Organization's Food Price Index currently stands in March this year at its highest point since its inception in 1990. And the previous food price spike in that index in 2008, during that time there were indeed food riots in some countries of the world. So it is a vital area for consideration this afternoon. It is clear that with global population growth, we must produce ever more food from the same or even diminishing area of land. A recent major report, I think from the WHO, estimated that we will need to double food production by 2050. The population demographics are also changing quite rapidly. There's a quite rapid growing middle class in Asia in particular, who all wish to eat more meat in their diet, with the impact for demand on animal feed in particular. And of course there is also climate change, which is progressively affecting agricultural food production through heat, drought and other stresses. But it is not just the quantity of food which is important. We must also consider its quality, and we're becoming increasingly aware of the importance of particular foods in the diet in either causing disease or promoting health, although the evidence is not always so far as strong as we would like. New technologies in plant and agricultural sciences, and in particular genetics, are enabling us to improve both the yields of crops and also the content of nutritional and anti-nutritional factors. The 3 speakers this afternoon will deal with different aspects in these areas. In the interest of time, I won't give detailed introductions, but I'd encourage all of you to read the speakers' CVs in the conference program. But suffice it to say, they're all world-leading, significant figures in their fields. So first, we have Professor Donald Ort from the University of Champaign-Urbana in Illinois, who, in addition to a long list of awards, is currently editor-in-chief of the journal Plant Physiology. He is a plant scientist who focuses on photosynthesis and is leading research into the effect of environmental stresses on yields and production. So, Donald, please.
Thank you very much, Matthew. If we could start the presentation. What I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes is talk to you a bit about the assignment that I've been given, and that is really to talk about this aspect of more food and how we produce it. And what I'd like to do is first review what some of the drivers are in terms of why we need more increased agricultural production. I'd like to present you to the argument that, in fact, to meet agricultural demand by the middle of this century, we can't do it with the same tools that we've been using. We need a new set of tools. And then finally, I would like to show you some opportunities that there are, in fact, for these new set of tools and how we can drive increased production. And what you see on this first slide here is the Corn Belt of the United States. Matthew's already mentioned this, and this is, I think many of you have already seen this. This is a demographic of world population growth. About 2,000 years ago, there were 300 million people on this planet. Population exploded about 200 years ago. In 1999, world population exceeded 6 billion. It's about 6.8 billion now, and as you can see from this demographic, it is projected to plateau somewhere in the middle of this century between 9 and 10 billion. In addition to the fact that population has grown, another thing has happened, and that is that during the last 2 decades, there's been a large increase in the prosperity, particularly in developing countries. And these two facts, increasing prosperity and increasing population growth, have really conspired to bring about the situation that many are now predicting that a near doubling of productivity on a land area basis will be needed to meet agricultural demand before the end of this century. What you may not know is that the incredible increase in productivity that we've enjoyed over the last 50 years has been driven almost totally by an increase in productivity. That is an increase in the amount that we produce on a land area basis. You can see that from this slide. And so here's total grain, and what you can see is that in terms of land planted, it plateaued somewhere in the 1970s and is actually beginning to decline. And the result of this is that in terms of the acres per person there is to develop to grow food, it is decreasing and is projected to continue to decrease. And so in order to meet agricultural demand, that is a doubling of productivity before the end of this century, not only do we have to increase the rate at which productivity is growing, but we have to do it in a sustainable way. And in fact, what this slide is meant to show you is that's currently not happening. And so here's what's happening in terms of percent yield increase per decade over the last 3 decades. And you can see only in the case of maize has the increase in productivity on a decadal basis been sustained. In the case of rice, it's declining. In the case of wheat, it's probably declined to the point where there is no increase in productivity at all at this point. And in fact, in various important growing areas of the world, for instance, in China, it appears that somewhere around 2000 or 1995, rice yields plateaued and, in fact, may be actually declining. And this is true, for instance, in other small cereal grains, probably for wheat across the world. And this, of course, is an interaction in terms of genetics, but also genetics by environment, and environment's changing in ways that we'll discuss a little bit later. In addition to the fact that yields are not increasing at the rate that they were, in fact, declining in some of our major grains, there's also this other factor, and that is that with more and more attention towards biofuels, there are the potential of alternative land uses. And so what you see here is a planting of miscanthus in central Illinois, which is right in the center of the U.S. Corn Belt. And this is just an experimental plot, and so these are very productive crops. This produces about 40 dry tons per hectare of biomass. And this is a so-called second-generation fuel that would be converted into bioethanol from lignocellulose. But I guess the point that I want to make is that this is not just an issue looking forward. And so the Corn Belt of the United States produces about 40% of the total maize produced in the world. And last year, a little over a third of that went into bioethanol production. And so it's already the situation that we have transplanted about a third of the U.S. Corn Belt into the production of bioethanol. And so let's talk about what yield is. And the determinants of yield are fairly nicely expressed in this expression. And so this is harvested yield or potential yield. And it's the product of these four things. The first of these is just the total solar energy that's available on that plot of land over the growing season. And that's then acted on three genetically determined characteristics of the crop plant in terms of how much that solar energy is converted into harvest yield. And so the first of these is the efficiency with which the crop intercepts that solar radiation while it's in the field. The second of these is the conversion efficiency, the efficiency with which it takes that light and converts it into biomass. And then finally, the partitioning efficiency, which we also tend to call the harvest index, and that's the portion of that total biomass that gets partitioned into the part of the crop that we harvest. And so in the case of most of the grain crops, that would be grain, and the other major food crop, it might be a tuber. And so this interception efficiency, this EI, is determined by several things. One is the speed at which the canopy develops, and so the speed at which the leaves are deployed and cover the ground so that they can intercept the light that is coming down. And for the top performing crop cultivars, this is already at about 90%. And so corn and rice and soybean intercept about 90% of the total radiation that falls on that land during the growing season. And so this is very close to the top and suggests that there's very little room for improvement. Now, one caveat to that is this calculation of 0.9 is determined in the length of the time that the crop's in the field and doesn't really take into account foregone opportunity. And so there is the possibility with global warming that some of these growing seasons may increase, and therefore more total solar radiation could be intercepted because the crop's in the field longer. So the second thing is partition efficiency or harvest index. And so for some crops, like our small grain, the increases that we've seen over the last 50 to 60 years have been almost due entirely to this trait. And right now, for things like wheat and rice, about 60% of the above-ground biomass is partitioned into the grain. And there's various theoretical reasons to think that this is very close to the top. And so the theoretical estimate of what maximum partitioning can be, maximum harvest index, is about 65%. And you can see that for our best crops, we're already at 60%. And so there's very little room for improvement there either. And so these two things that I've just talked about, the efficiency of the interception of light and the harvest index, are the two things that drove the Green Revolution in the 20th century. I guess the argument I'd like to make to you is they're pretty well maxed out. And so if, in fact, we're going to double production, we're not going to do it on the back of these two things that drove the Green Revolution. And so a very good indication of how harvest index has driven the Green Revolution. Here's wheat. This is the year of introduction of different wheat varieties, and this is just the harvest index. And so wheat that was planted 100 years ago had a harvest index of about 35. By 1960, it was at about 52%, and then by 2000, it was 60 or 61%. And so this has been driven almost entirely by harvest index, and that was due to the deliberate introduction of dwarfing genes into these small cereals. And so what's left in that yield equation, the thing that's left in that yield equation, is conversion efficiency. And this is essentially the total photosynthesis being done by the crop minus the respiratory costs of having that crop there. And its efficiency is only a few percent. As you can see here, here are various kinds of crops, and These are kind of average efficiencies that you get across the growing season. And what you see is that only about 1 to 1.5% of the total solar energy that's available on the land is captured in the biomass by the end of the season. And so this certainly suggests that there is opportunity to increase yield based on increasing the efficiency of photosynthesis, that is, the efficiency in which solar energy is converted into biomass. And this is an example of, in fact, that if you do increase photosynthetic efficiency, you do increase yield. And so these are experiments that we've done at the University of Illinois in our FACE project. And FACE is just an acronym for free air carbon enrichment, in which we can grow crops under CO2 concentrations that are predicted for the middle of this century. So I direct your attention here. This is the ambient CO2 concentration of today, about 380 parts per million. What's predicted for the middle of this century is about 550. And so over a period of 8 years, we've grown soybean under these two conditions, and this is a summary of the result. And so if you look at yield, there's been an increase of yield of about 15%. The total solar energy, because these are side-by-side experiments, is the same. The energy capture efficiency, even though this canopy is larger, they're both capturing 90% of the total sunlight that's available during the growing season. The harvest index, or that's partitioned into yield, actually has gone down a little bit. It goes down about 3%. It's small, but it's statistically significant. And so what has driven this increase in yield? It's been driven entirely by an increase in photosynthetic efficiency of about 19%. And we understand why this is. At elevated CO2, there's more CO2 that's available for the carboxylating enzyme. And so the carboxylation rate is higher, both because the substrate is higher and also because the CO2 suppresses a kind of anti-photosynthesis that's called photorespiration, in which the enzyme reacts with oxygen rather than CO2. And so the point of this slide is, in fact, that if we increase photosynthesis as predicted, yield does go up. And so what are some of the opportunities to improve crop yield by improving photosynthetic efficiency? And I don't have time to go into many, but I'd like to give you just a few examples. And these examples really have to do with the fact that crop plants aren't really that well adapted to the situations in which we grow them. And so the first one is the CO2 concentration. And so all of the ancestry of our crop plants developed at a CO2 concentration that's much less than it is today. So what you see on this plot is the CO2 concentration over the last 500,000 years. But in fact, records indicate that for the past 25 million years, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is at about 240 parts per million. Right before the Industrial Revolution, it was about 260 parts per million. And in the 150 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it's gone from there to 285 parts per million, or 385 parts per million, and is increasing every year about 2 ppm. And so these plants and the ancestors of crop plants are not adapted to the CO2 concentration that exists in the atmosphere right now. And so what are the consequences of that? Well, the enzyme that's involved in fixing gaseous CO2 into the first carbohydrate product of photosynthesis is really not a very good enzyme. It wasn't one of evolution's proudest moments. And so it's an enzyme that's called rubisco. It happens to be the most abundant enzyme on the planet. And one of the reasons it is so abundant is because it doesn't turn over very fast. But there are different kinds of this enzyme that are deployed through nature, the kinds that we have in crops like soybean and wheat. But then there's also rubiscos that have been designed to operate in higher CO2 concentrations. And you find these in some kinds of algae that have CO2 concentrating mechanisms, but also in certain kinds of terrestrial plants, the so-called C4 plants, in which the plant expends extra energy to concentrate CO2 into these special compartments where this reaction takes place. And so what this is meant to demonstrate to you is it asks the question. And so we know a lot about photosynthesis. We have very good theory about how it works. And so we can ask questions based on models. And so one of the questions that we asked was if we take soybean and we replace the Rubisco that's in soybean with a Rubisco, say, from corn or some C4 plant, how will that affect the yield or how will that affect photosynthesis on a seasonal basis or a daily basis? And so here's the current crop, and you can see that the daily integral of photosynthesis is about 100 millimoles per mole chlorophyll per day, and so 100 millimoles of CO2. Now, in our modeling exercise, we have taken that soybean plant, we've taken out the soybean Rubisco, we've put in corn Rubisco, and now that daily integral of photosynthesis has gone to 1250, or about a 17% increase. And so we did this model in 2004. Just before I came here, I reran this model for the concentrations that exist in 2011, and this goes to 19%. And so this is a kind of change that, in fact, is going to become more and more beneficial as the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere continues to go up. And so these are huge. You know, seed companies are looking for 0.5% increases. And so this is a kind of increase that's approaching 20% that could be brought about by the intervention of putting an already existing Rubisco from another plant into this plant. Another example, our plant's too green. And so all of the ancestors of our crop plants evolved to be good competitors. And to be a good competitor, what you want to do is you want to take in as many resources for yourself as you can. And you don't even have to need all those resources, but by taking them in, you deprive all of your competitors for the same resources. And those resources could be things like water, they could be nutrients, but also light. And so what a good competitor does is it absorbs as much light as it can, even though it might not be able to use it to deprive a competitor from it. And so this is the situation that you have in an agronomic canopy. At the top of that canopy, about 75% of the daylight hours are spent in a situation of saturation. And so this is the intensity of the solar radiation, and so it's very low in the morning, and by mid-afternoon, it's gotten up here. And this is the efficiency of photosynthesis. And so what it tells you up here at saturation is you can give it more light, but it doesn't do any more photosynthesis. But understand at the same time that these leaves at the top of the soybean canopy are completely saturated and not making efficient use of that light, 80% of the leaves that are down in that canopy are light-starved. They're down here somewhere. And so more of this light got down in here, you would increase photosynthetic efficiency. And so once again, we did a modeling exercise, and we asked the question, what is the ideal concentration in a soybean canopy? Ideal chlorophyll concentration in the soybean canopy to maximize the daily integral of photosynthesis. And you find a surprising thing, and I direct your attention just to here. And so this canopy extinction coefficient is directly related to photosynthetic content. This is what it is now in terms of the daily integral of photosynthesis. And so this is the very green crops that we're all familiar with. If we reduce that greenness, that amount of chlorophyll, by half, therefore reducing the amount of light that's being absorbed at the top of the canopy, allowing it penetrate into the canopy, we anticipate a stimulation of photosynthesis of 30% or more. And so again, we have a very basic aspect of plant and photosynthetic anatomy that's not adapted for the crop situation. And this is just a summary table that we published recently in an annual review that looks more broadly at a variety of kinds of opportunities to increase photosynthetic efficiency. And we've divided them into long-term, mid-term, and near-term. And so here's one of the near-term ones that I just mentioned, the optimization of chlorophyll. One of the mid-term ones is to put the C4 Rubisco into a soybean plant. That's mid-term because we don't know how to do it. This enzyme has gene products from both the chloroplast and the nucleus, and we just don't know how to put those in an efficient way. And so there are a variety of others, and you see that all of these are in the range of 15 to 30%. Some of them there's proof of concept for in model plants, some of them there's proof of concept in crop plants, and others are based exclusively on modeling. And so I'd like to end and just give you the take-home messages. These are the things that I hope that I promised you at the beginning. The first is that a doubling of productivity will be required to meet agricultural demand for the end of this century. Those factors that drove the green revolution of the 20th century, we can't rely on them. They're maxed out. And in fact, we see that there are declining rates of increase already showing that they are maxed out. And then finally, what I hope that I've shown you is that certainly we can anticipate that crop plants are going to be able to deal with their environment better. And that's what the breeding companies are really looking at, how they deal with drought, how they deal with bionic interactions. And that we have every confidence is going to improve. But in addition to this, we think that at least a 50% in photosynthetic conversion efficiency will be required to double crop productivity and meet agricultural demand. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Donald. So we've decided that since the three speakers are all participating in the discussion session immediately following, that we would, instead of having questions as we go along, we will, if you wouldn't mind, save your questions until that discussion period. But please do text in, SMS your questions using the number which is on the bottom of the screen. Okay. Our second speaker this afternoon is Dr. Hervé Guillemard. He is an agricultural engineer and economist and is research director for the field of agriculture for INRA, the French National Institute for Agricultural Research. He has particular interests in the EU Common Agricultural Policy and particularly with regard to the environment. So, Hervé, please.
Take that? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. Okay, so I think that my presentation will be a good complement to the first presentation because I will try to focus the presentation on how it is possible to increase production, to increase productivity, and simultaneously, in fact, to respect all the aspects of the environment. And so the title of the speak is Sustainable Agriculture on Global Food Security. What can we wait or hope from agronomic research? And it's a presentation I prepare with my colleague because I am economist, so I'm not able to speak on all subjects. And Christian is agronomist, so I suppose, and I'm sure it's better than me to speak about all the aspects of agronomy. In the first part of the presentation, I will like to say something on the global issue, on the global challenge. So as you know, the challenge is how to feed more than 9 billion people by 2050. I take 2050, but it's the same for other year, while simultaneously preserving natural resources first and also protecting the environment. And the first point I would like to say, it's not just a matter of calculating how much food is needed and then producing this quantity of food. You have first and simultaneously to take also into account of what is happening on the demand side, on the consumption side. And so you have to take that simultaneously, and I think it's very important also to take into account what is happening on the consumption side. Because what we know as food riots, for example, for the moment, is not a question of supply, it's mainly a question of demand. Is that this is a question of access to enough food at a price which are not too high, safe to eat, and nutritionally balanced. And for that, you need, and because I'm an economist, I can say that, you need economic growth, you need a development in all parts of the world, you need poverty alleviation, you need a different income distribution, both at the world level and also within countries. And for that, you need, of course, national macroeconomic policy and also international policy. The second point with that is I would like to say that we know that consumption habits of developed countries and also rich households in emerging countries cannot be generalized to the planet. for many reasons, for health reasons, for nutritional reasons, for environmental reasons. And so also we have to take into account the issue of access to food, but also we have to take into account the issue of consumption losses and waste at transformation level, at distribution level, and also at final consumption level. And as you know, this level of loss and waste is very important, and it's also important to reduce loss and waste to increase, in fact, food which is available to everybody on the planet. And the last point I would like to say about that is, as you know, in many poor countries, in many poor households, in poor countries, you have the double burden, that is, you have simultaneously obesity and undernutrition, and of course you need policy to address that. The second point on the global challenge, I would like to say, is also that the food challenge is not only an issue of consumption and supply, and how supply can meet, in fact, consumption needs. You need to do that, and this applied not only for production, but also for demand. You need to do that by respecting, in fact, natural resources and environment. As you know, energy and environmental issues are well known. You have the depletion of fossil energy, in particular petroleum product. You have to protect soil and water. You have the issue of biodiversity, which is a very huge issue. You have, of course, the issue of climate change, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So you have very strong environmental issue. That means that while farmers will have to produce more, as was shown in the first presentation, they will have to produce food products, but also energy and industrial products in substitution for petrochemical products. But they will have to do that on the planet using less energy and with a better respect on the environment, both in developed country and in developing country, even if the solutions are not the same in the north or in the south of the planet. And simultaneously, farmers will have to produce, in fact, or to provide services, environmental services and rural services, in particular in terms of soil management, water management, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, landscape too, and so. And so the issue is not only how to produce more on other things, but also how to produce more food and non-food products, services, and how to produce that in a better way. And so I will try to present very quickly what we call intensification of agriculture or ecological intensification in the agricultural sector now. And so the challenge is we have as agronomists, I can say that, is to define, to develop, and to implement, in fact, sustainable agricultural practice system, sector, and territories. And the point I would like to underline here is that we need to do that not only at the farm level, but also at the territory level, at the country level, and at the planet level. And we need a consistency between what farmers are doing in their field and the objective at the global and planet level. Of course, we need sustainable system practice and sector from an economic point of view. That means that farmers need to obtain sufficient, I don't know how you define sufficient, but sufficient farm income from the farm. We need competitiveness in the agricultural sector as in other sectors, but they have also to be sustainable from an environmental point of view, using less fuel and fossil energy, less water, less fertilizer and pesticide, adapted to climate change. That means that not only the farm sector and the forestry sector has to adapt to climate change and climate change effect, but also we wait from the agricultural sector that this sector produce less greenhouse gas emission, and in a global way on a land area which will be the same tomorrow that the land area we use today for agriculture. That means that we need what we call ecological intensification of the agricultural sector, and that is how to produce on the same land area with an increasing respect of environment and a better protection of natural resources. And of course, it's a very difficult challenge, but research can help to address, in fact, this challenge. And I would like to show that how it's possible to address this challenge on an example and after in a more general way. There is not a single solution to this problem, and tomorrow we will have agricultural system which will be much more diversified than the agricultural system of practice we have now, for example, in the EU or in France. Because we need system which will be adapt to local conditions, but also which will be adapt to needs and demand, and food and non-food demand. And this demand will be also more diversified tomorrow than today. Science and research has the potential to help to address this challenge by combining, in fact, all research, that is research in particular in genetics, and as well using conventional breeding, but also biotechnology, including GMO in some countries where it's possible to use that, but also using new agricultural production management practices, using agronomy and agroecological approaches. And the point I would like to say and to insist is that we do not have to consider that there is genetic on the one side and new production management practices and system on the other side. In fact, we have to combine both genetic management practices, but also social science and so on, to define, in fact, the new system in the agricultural sector on the planet. I would like to show that on using the example of pesticide use. You know, in many countries in the EU, you have very important objective in terms of pesticide use reduction, minus 50% in France, if possible. It's written in the text. But and we will achieve achieve this objective not only by changing, in fact, system and practice, but also using new varieties that breed sustainable resistance against disease, pest, and insect. And I would like to show this point. The challenge in terms of protection of plants and animals is, in fact, to have the same level of protection as we have today, the same level of prevention of health events, and an efficient management of the effect when you have health event occurring. But simultaneously, we would like to have this level of protection while limiting and, if possible, reducing, in fact, the use of pesticide and veterinary medicines, because it's the same in the animal sector. This for many reasons, for health reasons, for environmental reasons, for animal welfare reasons, and so on. We think that this issue of plant protection and also animal protection, this issue will increase in the future because of globalization and because of the effect of climate change. And so we have to find new solutions. And for the moment, research is working on many things to address, in fact, this issue. First, we do not exclude the fact that we can use novel bioactive compounds, but we have to work on new and safe chemical. You have to work on new options like elicitor, it's written on the slide. We can use, in fact, progress in predictive epidemiology to optimize biological and ecological control method. We can also work to create and to manage, in fact, resistance in breeds and varieties. And also, we have the possibility to use, in fact, the diversification of production, the diversification of product system to try, in fact, to address this issue by this spatial and temporal diversification. If I take the example of resistance to plant virus in a few words, and so it's an explanation of an economics of something which is very difficult for an economist. So it's if I summarize what I understand of that, or what we can say of that, it's really an issue for many crops, and the effect of virus disease are very important for major crops in many, many countries. For the moment, we use, in fact, different farming practice based upon the propagation of virus-free plant material and the exclusion of the virus vector from the growing crop to address this problem. But also, we are trying to address this issue by using progress we are making in terms of genetic resistance against the virus or the virus vector. We are making a lot of progress in the understanding of the molecular nature and mechanisms associated with virus genes, with natural virus-resistant gene. We are characterizing an increasing number of dominant or recessive resistant genes. We have a better understanding of new principle of innate immunity to virus associated with gene silencing. And this is possible now thanks to many progress we are making both in terms of biology, driven in fact by advance in technology. And so we are hoping that new progress we are making around the world in terms of genome sequencing on an increasing number of crops, and simultaneously huge progress in terms of technology will allow to have both faster and larger scale analysis. And so it will be possible, given this progress, to have increasing opportunity in terms of crop germ plat genetically known for resistance. And it will be possible to deliver, in fact, the solution to the industry more quickly. And we hope, I don't know exactly in many years, but we hope also that it will be possible to move from a reactive solution of a reactive approach we have now to a more predictive and proactive approach. And simultaneously, we have to address the issue of virus disease here by using what I call spatial and temporal diversification of production and production system. And it's mainly what we call integrated pest management. And as I mentioned before, we have to use simultaneously what we do in terms of biology, biotechnology, and this this management system we call IPM. So very quickly, IPM can be defined as it's a systemic or integrated approach of crop management, and we try by this method to solve ecological problem. IPM can be considered as a continuum. We have first a possibility of optimize the pesticide use, okay? We have also to use substitution possibility, and the better way to do that is to have a complete or radical, in fact, redesign of production system by acting on variety using genetics, on crop rotation, on landscape, and so on. So the IPM program, in fact, use information. This is the main point of the life cycle of pests and the interaction with the environment to define if you try to optimize, to substitute, or to redesign, in fact, production system. There are 6 components very classically in an integrated pest management program. The first is that we are of farmer and researcher and so on work on acceptable pest level. And the main point is that we want, in fact, not to eradicate pest, but we want to control, in fact, pest. We have to define or to work on preventive cultural practice. You have, of course, a lot of observation because it's very demanding in terms of monitoring and observation. You have, after the use or the possibility to use mechanical controls, you have also the possibility to use biological controls, and at least you have what they call a responsible pesticide use, which is also a possibility to address the issue. And the integrated pest management is now applied in many countries around the planet, and there is a lot of research on all these aspects that is working on control, on what can be defined as acceptable pest level, working on practice, working on observation, working on a new way to control by using mechanical approach or biological approach. And in fact, in an integrated pest management research program, we have to work on all these issues simultaneously. That is, we have to work both on what we know on pest and on pest level and so on, but simultaneously we have to work on, for example, how it's possible to manage things by diversifying crops, by working at the landscape level using what we call landscape mosaic. We have to work on the development of permanent element or infrastructure like age or trips and so on. And it's by this way that we hope to solve and to, in fact, ensure the same level of protection with a reduced level of pesticide. And I give you on the slide the website or the address, in fact, of the ENDURE network, for European network for the durable exploitation of crop protection strategy, which is an example of IPM applied at the EU level on how researchers are working on this issue. Okay, to conclude, I would like to say that to address, in fact, the issue of how it's possible to increase production and simultaneously to protect, in fact, the environment, it's, of course, one very important objective for an institution like ENWA. I can say it's the main objective, if you want. And for that, we define, in fact, 7 priorities for the next decade. I will present them very quickly. There are first 2 scientific priorities. And the first is to develop predictive approaches for biology, using, in fact, that we have a lot of progress in terms of capacity, in terms of investigation capacities at different levels, from the molecular level to the living organism, population, and communities. We are huge increases in the acquisition rate of genomic data, and we have also opportunities which are given by the development of technology and digital science. And we use, in fact, these 3 areas of progress to work, hoping that this will help us to have a better understanding of biological mechanisms at various levels, to have better prediction of phenotype, to have development of interrogative biology, and so on. The second scientific priority is agroecology. And if I summarize it in one sentence, agroecology is the crucial necessity to overcome, in fact, the historical cleavage we have between agronomy on one side and ecology on the other side. And so our objective, and the objective of many institutions in the world working on agroecology, is to work on how agronomists, in fact, can use, in fact, the concept and the method of ecology, which classically are not applied to man-made ecosystem, but how it's possible to use the concept and methods of ecology for the application to crop and livestock system. And so by this combination of agronomy and ecology, what we call agroecology, we want to have a better understanding of mechanisms involved in interaction between landscape, farming practice, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. And I would like to add that not only we have to link agroeconomy and livestock system also, and ecology, but also we have to take into account social science and economic science, because we have to know how farmers and their organization, food industry and so on, can react to that. And these 2 main scientific priorities are targeted on 5 scientific challenges. The first is integration of the economic, social, and environmental performance of agriculture, livestock farming, and forestry. The second is the development of healthy and sustainable food system, because, as I mentioned, we have to do that not only for crop and livestock system, but for all the food chain. There is, of course, the issue of attenuation of greenhouse gas emission and adaptation of the agricultural and forestry to climate change and climate change effect. We have to take into account that we are waiting for farmer other things, that is the valorization of biomass for energy and chemistry. And finally, this is done to achieve the global food security objective, taking into account all the pressure and all the changes. And to do that, we need a systemic approach. We need systemic program, and we are trying to develop this kind of systemic project with, of course, scientific collaboration, because INWA is not, it's a big institution, of course, but it's not big enough to do that alone, and so we have to develop a lot of international scientific collaboration, but also we have to do that in close relationship with actors, and mainly we have to do that in close relationship with farmers in the field, because we think that we have, and we are sure that scientific progress we are developing, they have to be used to develop innovation, and we have to work with farmers to be sure that innovation can be accepted by this farmer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Hervé. Finally, our last speaker of the session is Professor Kathy Martin. As I mentioned earlier, is from the John Innes Centre in Norwich. She's a plant biologist and one of those rare, most highly cited scientists with a very long list of peer-reviewed publications. She's also editor-in-chief of the leading plant journal, The Plant Cell. Kathy investigates the regulation of biochemical pathways for the production of bioactive natural products in food, amongst many other things. Kathy.
Thank you. So Don has explained very nicely the challenge of trying to produce more food over the next 50 years, and Hervé has explained the challenge of trying to do that sustainably. I'm going to focus in my short presentation on trying to improve the quality of the food that we produce, because the food security is defined by the FAO not just as having enough or sufficient food for all people at all times, but also to have enough nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. The theme of BioVision is health, and our food is an incredibly important component of that. And this is because actually the major challenge or one of the major challenges in health over the next 50 years is going to be meeting the challenge of chronic disease. Yesterday, when I heard the plenary discussion about health as a basic human right, the discussion focused almost exclusively on communicable diseases, and yet the incidence of mortality, this is data from the World Health Organization 2005, from chronic diseases, these are the ones listed in purple, is 60% of total mortality in the year 2005. So 2 times the death from communicable and nutritional deficiencies. People tend to dismiss chronic disease as being a problem of rich countries, and this is not actually true. Again, these are data from the World Health Organization, but if you look at total numbers of people dying from chronic disease, the numbers in the very lowest income countries are almost as high as those in lower middle income countries, and considerably higher than in upper middle and high income countries. It's just that the proportion of people dying from infectious diseases is much smaller in high income countries. But it is a huge problem. Chronic disease is a huge problem for developing countries as well as for the developed world. It's also a huge economic burden. This is just figures again from that World Health Organization report in 2005, projected foregone national income. This is just from death from heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. And the scale here is on billions of dollars. So China was predicted in this decade to lose $500 billion in terms of foregone national income due to heart disease. So just some facts about chronic diseases. 80% of mortality from chronic disease occurs in low and middle income countries. So it's not a problem just for rich countries. The poor are much more vulnerable to chronic disease because of increased exposures to risk and decreased access to health care. And in addition, chronic disease causes poverty. So if you have the major breadwinner suffering from type 2 diabetes or from heart disease, then you have no source of income, so that leads to major problems of poverty. And perhaps the most important fact is that in this World Health Organization report in 2005, they predicted that without action, deaths from chronic diseases will increase by 17% between 2005 and 2015. So this is not something that we are dealing with. It is on the increase. And the important point about this increase in the likelihood of, in the increase in mortality from chronic disease is that chronic diseases are heavily influenced by socio-behavioral risk factors. There are three major ones: smoking, unhealthy eating, and physical inactivity. And that increase, projected increase in chronic disease is based largely upon this single risk factor here, unhealthy eating. So the risk factor of smoking is declining now through people's giving up smoking, through legal and through advertising campaigns. It's not the cause of the increase in projected increase in mortality from chronic disease. Physical inactivity is also a risk factor that is potentially increasing. Most of us spend most of our times now behind a computer screen and not doing physical activity. But the promotion of sports as leisure activities means that this is not the risk factor that's underpinning the projected increase in chronic disease. It is this unhealthy eating and the direct consequence of unhealthy eating, which is obesity, which then leads directly to different types of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. So obesity is a major emerging disease, particularly afflicting the poor, and obesity has a strong correlation with the incidence of several degenerative diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, glucose intolerance, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And these are just the projected increases in obesity for different countries. I mean, the current status for the US is that 60% of the adult population are classified as overweight or obese. And even in France, you see here, the figures are not so bad, 35%, but it's still an increase to 45% by 2020. And this is a cause of chronic disease. So why am I talking about this in a session about plants and agriculture? Well, it's not just a problem of eating too much, it's a problem of eating too much of the wrong things. So there is a school of thought that says that many of the problems of chronic disease are the result of a change in our diet, very dramatic changes in our diet. The human genome evolved at a time when we were hunter-gatherers, and the average diet of a hunter-gatherer was low in fats, relatively low in fats, compared to modern times, and high in vitamins and from leafy vegetables and fruits. Particularly in the last 200 years, we've had the increase in trans fats coming from food processing, particularly plant oils, a big change in the level of omega-3 long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids compared to omega-6, particularly dependent upon the fact that we feed our animals a grain-based diet, and grains are rich in omega-6 and low in omega-3, and a decrease in vitamin content and due to a decrease in the plant content of our diet. So the 10,000 years since cultivation started have not been long enough for our genomes to evolve to the new type of constituents in the diet. And this school of thought believes, I think with some credibility really, that a lot of the chronic disease that we're suffering, particularly obesity, comes from an evolutionary discordance between our genomes, which are designed to extract every calorie from what we eat, and our diet, our current diet. And you can see that with evidenced by, say, Native American Indian populations who develop very high instances of type 2 diabetes when they switch to Western-style diets. So, what can plant science do to combat chronic disease? And I think that plant science can do many things in terms of improving the nutritional content of foods. One of the major problems is that the world is now fed more or less by 4 food crops. They represent 65% of the food produced in the world. That's wheat, maize, rice, and potatoes. And for some people in the world, their diet is pretty much exclusively on one of these major food crops, for example, cassava or rice. And that, in turn, leads to nutritional deficiencies because rice, particularly heavily milled rice, doesn't contain adequate vitamins. So the first thing that plant science can do is to rectify nutritional deficiencies such as vitamin A deficiency. And this, of course, is the example of golden rice, where a long time ago now, more than 10 years ago, rice was engineered to start producing beta-carotene, which is a very effective pro-vitamin A compound, which can be converted to vitamin A and can solve the problems of 500,000 children who go blind every year as a result of vitamin A deficiency, and the resulting deaths due to reduced resistance to disease that also follows. So correcting nutritional deficiencies is one way that plant science can contribute very effectively to addressing the problem of chronic disease. I'm going to give 2 other examples, and these are not these are examples which can address the problems of both developed and developing countries. So they're not just exclusively aimed at developing countries. And one of them is work that I've been involved in with, looking at the nutritional benefits of blood oranges compared to the regular oranges that you're familiar with here. There are a number of Sicilian orange varieties that have been developed that produce varying amounts of anthocyanin. These are hybrids up here which produce lots of anthocyanins but don't taste very good. Some experiments that were conducted in a collaborative European Union project that I had tested the effects of blood orange juice compared to blonde orange juice, which is the yellow line, or water beverages in mice fed a high-fat diet. And the startling result of this was that despite the predicted weight gain by mice on the water beverage, if mice were fed exactly the same diet but had just blood orange juice as their beverage, they hardly put on any weight at all, so that they had 30% less body fat compared to those animals on the water diet, and significantly less weight than on the blonde orange juice. And it's believed that the active ingredient is the anthocyanins, the red pigments that are present in blood orange juice. Now, it's pretty difficult to do studies on humans with obesity, especially on EU funding, which doesn't run for quite long enough. So, but we have done some measurements of the effects of blood orange juice on cardiovascular risk factors in subjects that are classified as at risk of cardiovascular disease. They have elevated LDL levels in their plasma. And basically, these studies involve feeding at-risk patients a full English breakfast, or what is also known as an oxidative stress. And a fatty meal gives rise to various ghastly changes in your risk factors for cardiovascular disease. But if you eat this full English breakfast accompanied by a glass of blood orange juice, 500 milliliters of blood orange juice, you can have a significant impact on risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So these are data from at-risk patients fed one fatty meal and then either 500 millilitres of water, 500 millilitres of blonde orange juice, or 500 millilitres of blood orange juice, and the procoagulant activity of the plasma, which is the platelets, which is your predisposition to stroke, is significantly reduced by the anthocyanins in the blood orange juice. And the blood orange juice also has a specific protecting effect on the well-known increase in triglyceride levels that occur in plasma after a fatty meal, on arterial stiffness, and on the inflammatory response. So even if in this incredibly short-term experiment, one can demonstrate some beneficial effects of particular foods over other foods. So the idea then is that we all rush out and buy blood orange juice, and this is a problem because there's a real problem with the supply of blood orange juice or blood oranges, and that is because blood oranges come from Sicily originally, and they require a period of cold during the winter in order for them to develop the anthocyanins in the oranges. And you can only get such cold temperatures in a limited growing area, this side of Mount Etna, around Catania. And there are other problems with blood oranges. I mean, the breeding is a nightmare, but blood oranges tend to have many seeds and are not easy peeling. So there is a low level of production of blood oranges at the moment, and some years the entire crop is trashed, like last year in Spain, because the winter temperatures didn't get cold enough. So one of the things that we've been doing is to investigate the genetic basis of the blood orange trait, and we've identified a gene that is responsible for inducing the production of anthocyanin in fruit. And we've shown that in blood oranges there is the insertion of a retrotransposon just upstream of this gene, which then places the gene under the control of the retrotransposon and induces it in its production, the production of anthocyanins in fruit. Now, retrotransposons are stress responsive, and it's thought that probably the dependence of blood orange on cold is due to the fact that the cold temperatures induce the activity of the retro element. The other important point about this little story is that all varieties of blood orange, though they may produce very different amounts of anthocyanin, all carry the same mutation. So there is no genetic variation available to get a cold-insensitive blood orange so that we can increase the production. And I think this is a real example where there is a limitation in the natural variation that's available to us, and we should now be thinking about genetic modification methods such that we can express this PMC gene under a different promoter and get year-round temperature-independent blood oranges so that we can make everyone a little bit healthier. Now, yesterday, people emphasized that education was an incredibly important part of developing effective health policies. And of course, the National Cancer Institute and National Research Council in the US have been recommending for over 15 years this 5-a-day program that people should be eating at least 5 servings of fruit or vegetables per day. The problem is that even with very relatively educated people, and let's say that Americans are relatively educated, out of 15,000 people surveyed, only 23% of Americans still achieve this intake. That's after 15 years of campaigning. What's even more worrying is that the numbers that attain 5 a day have decreased over the past 10 years. I think a lot of people, and I'm probably one of them, think, well, you do it for a week and then it's all right. But this is a lifelong commitment. And essentially, then the message of this is that it's actually very difficult to get people to change their diets, and information campaigns are not particularly successful at doing it. In addition to that, the cost of the foods that are good for us, such as fresh fruit and vegetables, have gone up over the last 25 years, whereas the cost of things that are bad for us have gone down, like particularly sodas and fats and oils. And so for poorer people, there's really a strong incentive not to eat the right diets. So I think it's at this junction that we can think about, well, perhaps we could use methods to engineer foods that people do actually eat in significant amounts to make them healthier, and that we can address the problem of nutrition in that sense. And these are experiments that we did some years ago now, which was to express regulatory proteins in tomato, and these induce the production of 2 minutes left, anthocyanins in the tomatoes, so we make purple tomatoes as a result of this genetic transformation. Now, they're quite pretty to look at, but they're also quite good for at least mice. We tested these purple tomatoes by making supplements of diets, rodent diets, 10% supplement with freeze-dried tomatoes, either purple tomatoes or red tomatoes, and fed them to P53 knockout mice, which are highly tumorigenic. The results in terms of life expectancy, the blue line shows the life expectancy of mice on the standard diet, which is 140 days. And this is absolutely standard for whoever undertakes these experiments. The effect of the red tomato supplemented diet was very small. So the line is a little bit wobbly off the blue line, but that's because we used a smaller number of animals. But when animals were fed the purple tomato supplemented diet, then although they all died, they died less frequently, so they had a longer life expectancy than the animals on the standard diet. So just the nutritional supplement with these high anthocyanin tomatoes, which are equivalent to the levels that you can get in berries, like blueberries or blackberries, extended the shelf life of the mice, extended the lifespan of the mice from 142 days to 182 days. That's a 30% increase. So I think that biofortification of crops by genetic modification can contribute to reducing chronic disease. And I think that genetic modification has to be considered. It's just one tool in the box, but we can consider it when trying to engineer crops to fortify them in vitamins and phytonutrients. And we can also consider it when providing genetic variation that is an addition to that is available naturally. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to our three speakers. I'm now going to hand over to Don Alt, who is going to moderate a discussion on this topic for the remaining part of the afternoon. So, Don and the remaining speakers, thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Remind you, I'm Don Ort. I'm from the University of Illinois, and I'm moderating this discussion. The title of this discussion is Which Agronomy for Sustainable and Productive Agriculture? And I think both of these terms, or both of these features, productivity and sustainability, are without doubt the two central issues that are going to conspire to determine how effectively agriculture meets demands not only of the future, but also of the current generations. And each of these, that is productivity and sustainability, have multiple components, and I think these components, as you've already seen in the talks, are well represented on this panel, and I think are also augmented by people in the audience, both physically and on the internet. So, for example, productivity contains a variety of issues. It has scientific issues, and so we've heard some of those. These have to do with the discovery and implementation of opportunities to improve productivity, both on a calorie as well as in a nutritive level, and this is, of course, on a land area basis. Productivity also has economic issues about, for example, how do we integrate nutritional components into the value chain of crops, and what impact would that have? And then we've also begun to hear about some of the societal and political issues that are associated with these topics of productivity. For example, we've seen a number of instances where the way forward involves the introduction of genetic variability into our crops that doesn't presently exist, which suggests that there needs to be various kinds of genetic intervention in the form of GMOs. And so a societal issue is, to what extent do public reaction to GMOs impede the way forward? And from the political standpoint or the regulatory standpoint, to what extent do those regulatory features constrain everybody but the largest multinationals from introducing transgenic traits? And so as I've already said, we have a lot of diversity on this panel, and my goal today for this discussion is really to take advantage of this broad expertise and have an integrated discussion about what goes into determining productivity and sustainability in the long run. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to start out and ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves. Some of them you've already met. And I'd like to invite each of them to take a minute or two to review what their expertise is and what the perspective is that they bring to this panel discussion. Perhaps we can start over here with Mark. Most of you have not yet met Mark, so please.
Thank you. I'm Mark Van Ameringen. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, which is the major partnership globally created to address malnutrition, bringing together the UN system, the private sector, and NGOs and governments. And the focus of GAIN is very much to address malnutrition now and put programs on the ground or galvanize investments in addressing malnutrition. My background, I've been running this organization about 5 years. My background's as a political economist. I spent most of my career working in Africa, running development programs across East and Southern Africa, and also as an advisor to the G8 on Africa.
Well, I've already, I think, introduced myself. I work for the Norwich Research Park, which is a partnership between 6 major research organisations in the UK, and I work to coordinate activities. I'm originally a plant biologist myself and actually have quite long-standing interest in biofuels. But I think that's probably enough for me, though.
I'm a metabolic engineer, I guess, at the John Innes Centre, and I'm particularly interested in trying to investigate the mechanisms of action and to identify phytonutrients and how they work in animals.
I am an actual economist and statistician, and my main interest in terms of research was on modeling actual markets and trying to find it's possible to analyze consequences of WTO policy and actual agreement we have in terms of WTO, and also working on CAP reform within this context.
Okay, thank you. I think perhaps a good place to start this discussion is stimulated by one of the questions on the screen in front of me from someone outside. And it really brings up this topic about GMOs. And the question in front of us to start out this discussion is to Herb. And it has to do with GMO compatibility with IPM, with integrated pest management. Are they compatible? And if yes, why is it a taboo subject in INRA?
Thank you. I can say it's okay, but so to the two questions, the first, I really think that the GMO are compatible with IPM. As I presented, IPM is a way, it's a program, a systematic approach, trying to maintain a sufficient level of plant protection while simultaneously reducing effect on the environment. So I think that in some cases GMO are compatible with IPM. The second question was why it is taboo at INRA. It's not taboo at INRA. I don't know where is the man or the woman, but it's taboo in France. That is correct, and in many EU countries, and many countries in the world. But we at INRA, we really think that we need to have public research on this issue. And for the moment, and I think that it is accepted that we have research on GMO in laboratories. So the problem is when we want to go to fields, because for different reasons, in the process of the research, you need to have application in the field to test some hypothesis, and that is very difficult. But I would like to say that GMO is not taboo at INRA and in research in France. The problem is that it's taboo in country because many consumers in the EU and in France do not want really GMO, and it's also the reason why at INRA or at other organisms like INRA in EU, we are trying to discuss with many partners, including farmer, non-governmental organization, consumer association, and so on, trying to collaborate with them, trying to identify using sociology and so on, the main reason, in fact, of this opposition, comparing what is happening in the EU and what is happening in the US or in Argentina, for example. But really, it's very difficult for the moment to obtain from that a clear picture on how it is possible to really understand the many motivation of people in EU country who do not want to see GMO. There is a lot of reason for that, and I think that surely there is a lack of explanation, of clear explanation of the effect of that, of also what they can give to farmers, to the society in the world, and also of the effect of potential risk.
Thank you. Other panel members have a comment on that? Well, perhaps we can pursue this topic a bit further in terms of GMOs. I think that we've heard in a number of presentations that there is the perspective that the way forward in agriculture is to introduce genetic variability that doesn't exist in the crops of interest. And so Professor Martin talked about looking for genetic variability in the production of anthocyanins in blood oranges, and it wasn't there in terms of how it's being induced. I talked about adapting crops to new atmospheres and new environments. And again, these are environments that have come on very quickly, and the genetic material is not available in the crops. And so the whole issue is it's out there, and can we bring it in? And so the question I'd like the panel to discuss now is really twofold. One is how reliant are we in going forward on the ability to do genetic engineering? And to what extent are there constraints that are imposed by both public opinion and the regulatory issues that I think arguably stem from public opinion? And maybe I could ask Kathy that question first.
Well, I think one of the problems is that in the public's mind, the concept of GMOs is pretty much restricted to BT cotton or maize and herbicide tolerance, which of course have been the crops that have been introduced. But I think that the potential to engineer plants that are more productive, that are healthier, my personal experience has been that there hasn't been such a big consumer backlash, negativity. In fact, when we published on the purple tomatoes, I was inundated with calls from people wanting to grow them, wanting to get them, and wanting to eat them. And I think the idea that GMOs could actually produce something that's beneficial for consumers could do a lot to allay some of this perception of a resistance to it. So when a colleague once said to me years ago, if we could make a plant that would, if you ate it, it would reduce cellulite in women and stop men going bald, then we'd have no problems. So that's one thing I think that we really need to do. The other problem that I see is that in response to the initial resistance to GMOs, we have a very burdensome regulatory approval system, not just in Europe. I mean, it's incredibly expensive in the US. And I think one of the most tangible arguments against GMOs is that they benefit only multinationals. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If it costs minimum $6 million and probably to get an end product out there, $200 million to get a GMO out there and grown, then only the multinationals can afford to do it. And the useful things, the things that will benefit society, are things that can be produced by publicly funded bodies. And we can't afford to undergo the regulatory, go through deregulation.
Other comments from the panel? Mark?
Well, just, I mean, I think what certainly we're seeing in many developing countries a lot more openness to GMOs, particularly with climate change and the need for new drought-resistant varieties. But having said that, you know, just the new varieties and what's coming out of plant breeding still need huge investments as well and can have big impacts. And so there's an overall need for investment in both approaches, and I think that's where a lot of the development community is standing right now.
I think this segues into a related issue, and that is that in commodity agriculture, what a farmer looks at is the extent to which a GMO contributes to farm gate price and to their profits. And so I think from that standpoint, it makes sense that all of the GMOs that we see coming out of Monsanto and Pioneer are really targeted to the farmer from the standpoint of what their farm gate price is. And so I guess the discussion I'd like to have now is what's involved in getting things like the nutritive value of crops in the value stream of food production. And so I think this goes to a really critical economic issue that's associated with agriculture. And Mark, would you like to comment on that? I mean, how is it that we get these value-added things that may benefit the consumer into the value chain when they don't necessarily directly contribute to the farm gate price of the farmer?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is the awareness about the benefits of having more nutrient-dense crops and why that's not only beneficial to the farmer and their farmer's family, but also to the population at large. And I think that's a real issue. There's very low awareness of the benefits of nutrition across the board. I think and I guess the other part of this is that, and it's a bigger issue that overlies this, is that agriculture, food, nutrition, and health have never sat well together. They sit in very different silos, and until we actually can start to bring these different groups together along the same value chain and trying to have agreed outputs that are not just around yield, but also around addressing whether, as was said earlier, trying to address obesity, overweight, or whether they're trying to address stunting, underweight, and micronutrient deficiencies. So until you actually have output indicators or KPIs with those kind of focus, it'll also be very difficult to have that go all the way down to the farm and be bringing in new varieties.
Kathy?
So I think it's a very big problem to try and maintain the growth of nutritionally enhanced foods. I mean, I know with golden rice that one of the what they're now doing is trying to bundle it with other traits, producer traits, so that they can guarantee that farmers will go on growing it after the initial flush of enthusiasm, so that we can solve the problem in a kind of sustainable way. So I think that that's the answer, that for consumer traits, you have to bundle them with producer traits. You've got to have an incentive for people to grow them. But, I mean, on the sustainability front, I think that the herbicide tolerance in soybean has been absolutely fantastic in terms of more organic matter. I mean, the big plus side of herbicide tolerance in soybean has been the no-till policy, which has really made soybean farming much more sustainable and much lower inputs, and similarly with disease resistance as well. So these are all things that do have kind of societal benefits if people could only understand it in the bigger sense of it.
Don't put your microphone down, because we have a query from the audience, maybe on an update of golden rice. And so you've mentioned it twice, and the question is, what is the situation with golden rice today? Is it available? Is it safe? Is it working?
Yes, so some of the initial complaints about and I'm sure there's people in the audience who know more about golden rice than I do, but some of the initial complaints were that you'd have to eat tons of the prototype to be able to get enough beta-carotene to serve your daily requirement. They've now engineered it so that that there are adequate levels, so that in approximate a handful a day is enough to meet your dietary demands. They've done very extensive bioavailability studies to prove that beta-carotene is available, and it can supplement it can provide the adequate levels of beta-carotene. It's gone through field trials, and it will be grown. I think it may even be being produced commercially now, but it's certainly within the next couple of years.
And so I think that this is the whole issue of golden rice is an interesting commentary on what we already talked about, and that is the cost of bringing a transgenic crop to the market. And so in this case, it's not even a commercial market. It's a market to serve food insecure parts of the world, in which the regulatory pressures are much, much less. Even so, we're 15 years into this project, and there are still regulatory hurdles in front of it. And I heard people recently talking about this, and they estimated that it's even in this kind of humanitarian enterprise, about $25 million is necessary in order to get a genetic trait approved. And I talked to someone from Monsanto, and they estimate that the cost of getting a genetic trait in the field in a commercial line is between $150 and $200 million. And so these are enormous hurdles, and these are hurdles that are in some part driven by what public opinion is of GMO. And, certainly in some cases these may be justified. In other cases, many of us believe that they are probably not justified. And yeah, please go ahead.
So we got some questions here about blood oranges. Why not spread the blood orange cultivation to the northern areas with the proper conditions for anthocyanin development, such as the Adriatic area? Well, of course, you can't take citrus growing too far north because the frost kills the plants. So, you've got a bit of a problem there. And, I mean, there are, of course, it's not only grown in Sicily. I mean, the demonstration of the little map was that there are certain areas for growing blood oranges. It is grown quite extensively in Spain, but as I said, last year they threw the entire blood orange crop away because the winter temperatures didn't get cold enough. So if you talk to big company, orange juice companies such as Tropicana, they say, well, it's a novel, or it's a boutique product because the productivity is not reliable. So what is the commercial development plan for blood orange? You have to talk to the Sicilians about that.
So we have another interesting question here on the screen, and the question is it realistic to expect a 50% productivity increase with an agroecological approach? And so you've heard several times this morning that it's anticipating that we need a doubling of productivity, that is a doubling of yield on a land area basis. And that really hasn't been talked about in the same framework as sustainability and looking at the agricultural system as a agroecological community. And so, Mark, is that something you'd like to talk a bit about?
Well, I can start on one aspect of it, and let my colleagues here talk about others. But I think, I guess where I would start to say is that, we can get huge productivity gains even by making more investments in the systems that we have right now, in the technology and knowledge that we have already. So we shouldn't be, forgetting that we do have good technology, and in many regions. I mean, I lived in Africa throughout the 90s and watched the systematic deterioration of all the investment in agriculture extension and agriculture infrastructure. And so, all the predictions are that, if you increase investment in agriculture, and productivity could go up, from anywhere from 30 or 50%, just with the existing knowledge and technology. So I do think, maybe just to start off, that there are a lot of gains that we can do with things that we do know already. I think the fact that we have climate change coming, really, I don't think there's a lot of choice then to start to look to some of these new approaches. But I think, we have enough knowledge now to actually start to drive these increases.
The first comment I would like to say, if as an economist, it's very difficult to say that we need a 50% increase in productivity. In fact, we will see the result, and the result will be confrontation between supply and demand, and this will be, in fact, the result. And so I prefer to model that and to see how it's possible to balance, in fact, supply with all the demand. So the second point I would like to underline is the point mentioned is that in many parts of the world, in many countries, the problem is it's really easy from a technical point of view. You have to, in fact, productivity is very low, mainly because you have no inputs. You have no water, no fertilizer, be they mineral or organic. You have no plant protection methods. You have no storage capacity, and you have no transport capacities. And we know that we have to play on this 5 level to increase productivity in many parts of the world, and in particular to increase productivity in sub-Saharan countries from Africa. And we know that for that, the main point is that we need investment. So we need money. And for the moment, there is no money. So it's very difficult. But from a technical point of view, it's not really difficult. And with respect to the question, and it is possible to increase productivity by 50% with an agroecological approach, say in a country like France or in EU country, that is in country where productivity is very high. I will say that for the next 10 years, the challenge is in the EU is not to increase productivity by 50% because it will be very difficult. The challenge is to maintain the level of productivity and production we have, and we really think that the agricultural approach, combined with new varieties and so on, which are more resistant to abiotic stresses, to many stresses and so on, is part of the solution. And as mentioned in my presentation, we think that the solution for tomorrow will be not a single solution, but solution much more adapt to local condition. And this is the reason why we have to work all together to define, in fact, the solution tailored to the agroecological condition, even in a country like France or even in the EU, and we have a lot of work to do that.
Thank you for that response. It partly addresses a question that's been sitting up here since we came up here, and it was addressed to me. And it says, Professor Oord, it's not the matter of producing more food, it's a matter of finding a better balance between north and south of the planet and a better use of food. And so I guess I would follow up with a question. You've said that a 50% increase in productivity is not a necessity. And so is it, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are you thinking then that we can use existing technology if it's applied worldwide to meet future agricultural demand?
No, the point I would like to say is that when some people say that we need to increase production by say, or productivity, and productivity and production is not the same, but say productivity by 50%, or when the FAO says that we have to increase production by 70% to satisfy demand, I would like for me, it's really difficult to say something on such a figure because it depends of so many things. It depends of if we use a lot of crops to make biofuels, for example. And so it's really difficult to say that. And of course, if we use a lot of crops to satisfy some energy needs and energy demand, we will have to increase productivity and production by a higher percentage. And so it's the reason why I think that the final issue is an economic issue, and we will see how land will be used for food uses or non-food uses or for services and so on. So with respect to your, that is the first point for me. The second point, when I say that in countries where productivity is high, like many countries in the EU, but also in the US for some crops, but not for all crops, as you know. The challenge, in fact, if we are able to maintain, in fact, the level of production with an agroecologic approach, I think that we will be happy with that. And if we want, and we think that we need, after 2020, 2030, and so on, to increase productivity and production, we need, of course, to have new technology to increase this productivity. And I really think that it's important to apply the agroecological approach now, to change the technology and so on, because for farmer and for farmer income, they need to increase productivity, but not only productivity, they need also to have a better ratio between what they sell in terms of product and services and what they use in terms of inputs.
Other comments on this? Mark?
Well, I mean, just in terms of the question of, finding a better balance between north and south, I mean, I think, we absolutely need to. I mean, we do need to increase significantly investment in agriculture in those countries that are suffering from hunger and malnutrition, not to be just looking for exports or food assistance programs. I mean, I think that's in any scenario, that has to be at the top of the list. And and I think if you look at who are those hungry and malnourished, if they're looking at the billion at the bottom who are hungry, half of those are small farmers, mainly led by women, households led by women, and they are, those are the ones that we really need to be putting a lot of investment in. So I think the big message is we do need to reprioritize investment, and it also links very much to meeting the MDGs, because in many countries, agriculture is going to be the locomotive of growth. It isn't going to be services. It is, and the investment. Cell phones are great, and they can be a great enabler, but there needs to be big investment in productivity in agriculture, and I think that's where we do need to start. I think the other part of this is very much being clear also that when we're prioritizing investment in agriculture in the South or in developing countries, it means also looking at the needs. And I think it takes us more to these nutrient requirements, where you have huge requirements of micronutrient related to micronutrient deficiencies, and there are no other sources to get them. So it might not be necessary to have golden rice or biofortified sweet potato in the U.S., but it certainly is if you're sitting in Malawi or even in India to have these available, because there are no other easy sources of micronutrients. So I would say that.
Okay, thanks, Mark. One of the points that was brought up in several talks is that we have dual drivers to agricultural demand. One is the one that's very obvious, and that's population growth. But the second one perhaps isn't quite as much on everybody's radar screen, and that is increased prosperity in formerly developing parts of the world. And these are mostly in Asia and specifically China and to some extent India. And this pertains to a question that we have here on the panel, or on the screen in front of us, and it has to do with meat consumption. And so the way this relates, of course, is that if you run the calories of maize through a pig or a cow, and not run it directly through a human being, then there is a denominator of about 7 or 8. And so you drop from the efficiency of feeding it directly to a human being to somewhere about 1/8 of that if you run it through a cow first. And this a little bit goes to the economic side of it. And over the last few years in the United States, just looking at what's happening to corn and soybean prices, where they were very steady for years and years and years at $3.50 a bushel for corn, and I realize we use odd measures in the United States, and $5 a bushel for corn. Now suddenly, over the last 3 or 4 years, they're talking about futures of $9 a bushel for corn and $17 or $18 a bushel for soybean. And so the demand is there, and a lot of that demand is actually coming from China, and it's to feed livestock. And so the question on the screen is, what about a significant and necessary decrease in meat consumption, and what percentage would be required to achieve some kind of meaningful effect on what agricultural demand will be in the future? And I'm not qualified to answer that. I hope someone on the panel is.
I can try to say something. I do not like very much that question like which percentage is achievable. First, I would like to say that there is also in many EU countries a campaign of people saying that you have to decrease meat consumption. I am not expert in nutrition that I do not want to say something on that because you know better than me. But the first point I would like to say is that in many parts of the world, and in particular in poor country, livestock, it's very useful for many reasons. And for example, because it's the only way to give organic fertilizer, that is to give organic fertilizer, and to give that from a point A to point B. And so when they are very poor, it's a very efficient way to increase soil productivity. The second point is that it's also an efficient way to use some land area which cannot be used for crops. And so do not forget that. And of course, I know that it's very difficult to say the part of land which can not be used for crops and we can only use by these animals. But do not forget that is very important. And the third point is that do not forget too that animals, for many farmers in the world, for many rural people in the world, it's income, and it's a very important part of their income. And so it's a way to have milk, to have meat, to sell something. It's a way to develop, in fact. And so we do not have to forget that. The second point is saying at the global point. It's to say we perform at INWA a foresight exercise called Agrimonde, saying or trying to analyze the various issues, environment, energy, food, and so on, issue in a framework which is supposed to be consistent, and trying to see how it's possible to sustainably food the world in 2050. And we compare, in fact, two different scenarios. First, a scenario where we have growth, liberalization of agricultural trade, and so on. And we observe that in 2050, in that scenario, it is possible to in fact, satisfy the food and non-food demand by the ritual sector. In this scenario, we have also an important reduction of poverty. The problem is that the effect on the environment, in particular in terms of water and biodiversity, are very negative. And by contrast, the second scenario assumes that in 2050, in each big region of the world, everybody eat 3,000 kilocalories, including 500 from animal products. Okay, that means that in countries like OECD, there is a decrease in total consumption and a decrease in animal consumption from by 800 kilocalories, I think, from animal products with respect to the level achieved in the US or in the EU. But in other parts of the world, this means an increase in total kilocalorie first, and a huge increase in terms of calories from animal products. And the conclusion is that in this second scenario, it is also possible to feed the world, or to achieve the consumption we assume for all parts of the world, even if we have disparity in each big region. We are able to do that by maintaining, in fact, the forest area. So in terms of climate change and biodiversity at a large scale, it's better than the first scenario. But in fact, in terms of poverty at the world level, it's not so good as the first scenario. And so this to show you that it's very difficult, in fact, to simultaneously achieve objective in terms of food, in terms of energy, in terms of environment, in terms of inequality reduction, and so on. And the last point I would like to say about that is in that scenario where we assume a reduction of meat consumption in OECD country and an increase in some country in Asia or in Africa, the one conclusion, and in fact is a common conclusion for all scenarios we perform, is that in 2050 we need a huge increase in trade. Because in many parts of the world, in particular in Africa and in many countries in Asia, where we expect a large increase in population, the large increase in population will be, even if we have large increase in domestic production in this country, this increase in domestic production will not be sufficient to satisfy, in fact, the population, the needs of the population. And so you need increase in trade from OECD country, from Russia too, and from other countries, Ukraine and so on, and mainly from Latin America. And even in that scenario where we assume that we have a decrease in meat consumption in OECD country, so there is an increase in meat trade from this country to other country. And so it's not so simple to answer to the question what percentage can we assume and so on. The question is that, as I mentioned during my presentation, is that what we know is that if we extend, in fact, the consumption model we have in OECD country, the needed increase in production will be higher, of course. And so we have simultaneously to act on demand, and in particular, I really think that we have to reduce, in fact, losses and wastes we have at the consumption level in household and also in many places. We have to act on consumption, and if we act really on consumption, the needed increase in production will be lower, and so I think it will be easier to satisfy the increase or the required increase in productivity and production at farm level with an increased respect of environment and using less natural resources.
I think that it's quite evident now, both from your comments and from Mark's comments, that there are really two different conversations, whether we're talking about agriculture in the West and Europe and the United States, or whether we're talking about agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa and other insecure parts of the world. And they both have economic issues associated with them, and so the economic issue in the developed part of the world is, and which includes China and parts of India now, is that suddenly there, or not suddenly, but there is the economic wherewithal to consume, and so to consume higher up the trophic level. Whereas in the developed world, the economic issue really has more to do with, one, what food can afford to be purchased, and then two, the choices that are being made from the standpoint of livestock versus crops that's very tied up in, as you said, the economics and the agronomy of the way they live. And so there are two questions on the screen now that may have already been partially answered that are pertinent to this. And one is, just to read it aloud, don't you think that the cause of world starvation is more of an economic imbalance that is an agricultural issue? And then the second pertinent question is there only a problem in food quantity availability, or is it food access? And so these have been partially answered, but I wonder if you want, anyone wants to make specific comments about either of those two.
Yes, very quickly to answer very quickly to this question. At that time, the problem is mainly a problem of food access. I really think that. And this does not mean that tomorrow, and in 2050, for example, that we will have to increase production and productivity. But for the moment, the problem is not
even if some places you have problem. But at the world level, the problem is the problem of access to food, and in particular, access to food for the poor household in the poor countries. And so the problem is more a problem of economic imbalance, as is mentioned here. That's really an actual issue. But do not forget, as Justice mentioned, that amongst people, we are poor, very poor on the planet. Many of these people are farmers. And, but the problem is that I really think that these farmers have no factor of production, and they have no access, in fact, to market. And so it's very difficult for this farmer to participate to this market. And there are, for example, many studies which show that by increasing the possibility for the farmer to have access to larger market on a longer period of time for their products will be a very good solution, in fact, to increase their income. And I really think that also for this farmer, it's also indirectly, if you want, a problem of access. It's because they have not enough income, they cannot access to food. And so the answer is yes, it's a question of access for the moment. And I think that people know that it's a problem of access. And we have to solve, in fact, this problem by investment to increase access for these people to food. And I will add that the solution is not to have more protectionists at the world level. It's not really the solution, because more protectionists will not increase access for the poor.
I'm not sure I totally agree with you. On the question of quality, in the West we have access to all the foods that we want, but people, I mean, there's a terrible preponderance of foods that are not nutritionally sufficient, and malnutrition is just as malnutrition through obesity. There are now more people in the world who are obese than who are undernourished. And so I think it isn't just access, it's a question at least of quality of the food. Maybe the quantity of nutrient-rich or nutritious food is a problem.
I think that we agree. I think that it's access to food of quality.
Mark?
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same point. It is access to high-quality food. And I think the other part of that, food that is affordable, and that we need to not forget. But I do think the first point on trade policy is that, I mean, you know, I think those studies, I mean, it's 4 or 5 years ago, the OECD published a study just showing that to remove the EU Common Agriculture Policy, or the Farm Bill protectionism itself would be equivalent to more than tripling foreign aid in any one country, the economic impact. And so that, you know, I don't think that's changed. I think those studies have just been deepened to show the benefits of that. But I think when those studies were done, we didn't have all the biofuels subsidies either. So I do think if we are really looking at, you know, increasing agricultural yields and access, we do really need to keep, you know, the dough around and dealing with these issues, which don't seem to be making any progress. Nobody wants to take on farmers in the U.S. or in Europe. So, you know, I think that still needs to be a major focus for reform.
Microphone works better than my glasses. Obviously, this conversation is spurring a lot of interest somewhere. I don't know if it's in this room or elsewhere. And my worry is that a lot of these questions may be getting outside of the expertise of this panel. So the latest one that has popped up is, how can we morally go on with European subsidies on European products to southern markets? And I suppose related to that are two other questions that have to do with the access of farmers in the South to fair market prices due to impediments by trade barriers. And then the notion of important and key developing countries is to impose with taxes to protect local agriculture. And so I mean, a lot of what we've been getting into in this discussion really are policy issues, and they're policy issues that exist within individual countries but have international ramifications. And so I don't know if anyone wants to take on this issue of European subsidies to southern markets.
Okay, so the first point, it depends on what you call subsidies, at least for me. The common agricultural policy, it's a very, very complex policy. It's very difficult, even if you are working every day on this policy, to understand all the mechanisms, because there is a lot of different things. But if I try to summarize in three categories, you have tariff on imports, you have export subsidies, and you have domestic subsidies. And I agree with the question that export subsidies have really important negative impact on production in third country. But now, for this year, export subsidies are very, very low in the EU. And so we are trying, it's difficult, to reduce progressively, in fact, the subsidies. In terms of import in the EU, I will say that we have a system of duty on tariff, which is also very, very complex to understand. There is a lot of mechanism, a lot of exception, and so on. Say, for example, with orange juice, there is a system of tariff which is very difficult to understand for all fruits and vegetables. It's a complex system allowing import sometimes from people in Africa and so on. But I would like to say that if we take the global picture, mainly farmers from developing countries have a preferential access to the EU market for their product, of course. That is for tropical fruits, for coffee, cacao, banana, and so on. And so the paradox is that a liberalization scenario in the WTO will have a negative impact on this farmer and on this country. And so we are trying in the EU to implement system to compensate them for that, but I can say that for the moment it's not really very successful. The last point, and I understand that it's difficult to perhaps to understand that I really think that the main problem for the moment is the problem of access to food, of good food of quality, because there is a question of prices between different food items. But we need to increase production in the longer term. And so the question is, subsidies to our farmer, do they have an impact on farmer production and so on in developing countries? That is what we direct payments we give to farmers in the EU, or direct payments given to farmers in the US or in Canada. Do they have an impact on developing countries? And if you analyze a lot of studies on that, academic research, but also study made by FAO, made by OECD, and so on, you see that the impact of that is very small, in fact. So the impact of this subsidy is very small, because the main problem in this country, it's mainly a problem of investment, as we say, a problem of national policy in this country, and a problem of how you address the problem of price volatility at the world level. And this is not, of course, the EU contributes to that, like the Farm Bill in the US contribute to that issue, but the volatility of prices has to be addressed at the world level and not only at the EU level.
Okay, thank you. I suppose one of the conversations that we haven't had is the role of education, public education and otherwise. Professor Martin in her talk talked about how seemingly ineffective information campaigns can be in the developing world in terms of changing eating habits and changing health habits. And so there's a question that's come in that's pertinent to that, and it is, in order to stimulate competitive public research on food, biotech, and agronomy, what is the importance of efficient science, higher education, and communication between science and society, both in poor and rich countries, and how can this be achieved? And once again, I suppose the discussion is quite a bit different in the two sectors, whether we're talking about a poor country and a rich country. And so I could imagine, for instance, in a poor country, this conversation might be between a farmer and an extension agent or agronomist that's imparting information that's directly pertinent to the way they make the livelihood or way they make the subsistence. Whereas in richer countries, these conversations might be in more discretionary parts of their lives. And so I'm going to put Kathy on the spot and ask her to answer this question.
Thanks. I think there's a real need for public research in this whole area. I mean, I think, but the problem, and I'm speaking very much as a research scientist in a developed country, but the big problem at the moment is that funding for public research initiatives is being decreased. So in the UK, our Food Standards Agency is going to be abolished, and the idea is that industry should regulate food standards. I mean, it's unbelievable. That, and I think that there's also a very strong idea that all research on nutrition and in food should be done through industry, and that's fine. But I don't think that it necessarily serves the interests of the public not to have any public research in this area, because you tend to get food companies researching into their own products. So everyone knows that chocolate is terribly, terribly good for you because of all of the epicatechin that it contains, but it does have some downsides sometimes. So I think that there's a real need for public research. I think there's also a need in developed countries for, I mean, in my own area, we have for the past 20 years not been very strategic in terms of the research that we're funded to do. It's been very much working on models, on model plants, and not thinking about crops. And we're not really thinking about the applications of our work. And I think there has been a kind of sea change in that over the last 5 years. But we need to be listening to what society wants from us a lot more, rather than just saying, well, I want to work out how a Arabidopsis grows an extra millimetre under some conditions. So I think scientists are trying to take their interactions with society seriously, but perhaps we need to do more to explain what we're doing, and we need to think about why we're doing it. Now, I can't really comment on the situation in developing countries, but I think Don's absolutely right that it's a different scenario. It's a different type of dialogue that's going on there.
Yeah, I would just add that, certainly for developing countries, there is really a need for both significant investment in public and private research. If you look at the institutional infrastructure that was created after the Green Revolution with the whole Consultative Group for International Agriculture Research and all the centers, and then what happened over the last 15 years in the decline, and now they're merging into one structure, it just reflects that there has been, up until the last food crisis, there's been, it's been a free fall in funding for agriculture research in developing countries on appropriate agriculture. So now it's improving a little bit, but I think unless there is strong public investment and donor investment, it's not going to happen, because many of the crops and varieties too, they're not automatically. It's not automatically clear how someone's going to make money on pearl millet with zinc rolling out a new biofortified crop. So, and at the same time, I think one of the things that over the last 20 years where the CG system performed very badly was engaging with the private sector at all, in any significant way. And so I do think, as we look at this issue in the developing world, we do need increased donor funding for public research, but we need also to crowd in the private sector more effectively and be looking at more shared risk on some of the research, more public-private collaboration, and I think that will also help move us forward in terms of the developing world.
Thanks, Mark. I would just add one thing to what Kathy said, and that was that I think in both Europe and in the United States there is, I don't know if we would call it pressure, but there is certainly a tendency that more and more of our research is goal-oriented with fairly short-term goals, and so now there's more pressure not to be working on Arabidopsis, but or some model plant, but to do things directly in crop plants, which sometimes can slow progress. But I think the caution is that over history, we've been very, very bad at predicting what kind of discoveries are, actually create the sea change. And, and by and large, they are not discoveries that have come out of some mission-oriented research. And so there is some danger to focusing too much of our scientific attention directly on societal problems in terms of, what those next great discoveries, be they in biology or be they in physics, and where they're going to come from. So we have one other question on the screen. I actually questioned whether the assertion is true, but I will read it out. Why do we need GMO where organic production is less expensive and safer and healthier for the environment and has not yet been fully explored? And I certainly agree with the last part, that has not yet been fully explored. Whether it's less expensive, safer for health and environment, I'm not sure that the evidence is out there. And I suppose another aspect of this conversation ought to be, what is the capacity of organic gardening from the standpoint of meeting agricultural needs? Are we talking a few percent? Could it be developed into something that's 10%? And so I think capacity is also an important issue in terms of talking about organic food production. Would anyone on the panel like to discuss this?
With respect to this question, the fact is that organic food productivity in organic food production for the moment is lower than in other production systems. And so, and after, when it's, I do not fully agree when you say that it's less expensive. Okay, but I would like to. The answer is that I think that we really need both organic production and GMO. That is, there is a lot of needs and demands are different at the world level, and so as researchers we have to respond, in fact, to the different needs. Of course, they are very difficult to identify, and so it's the reason why we have to have discussion, debate, and so on with all the society, consumer organization, NGO, industry, farmer, and so on. But I think that if we want to achieve the food challenge, the energy challenge, and so on, we need to have a diversity of solutions. And I think it will be impossible to address all the challenge by saying that the solution is GMO or the solution is organic production. In some country, it's perhaps possible to have very high level of productivity with organic production, and so this is part of the solution. And in passing, do not forget that in the question it's written that it's safer in terms of environment. not in all cases, because we can find in some cases that it's not safer for the environment. It's the same for health. And so I think it's really important that we have to convince that we do not have a single solution for all problems. We have to find the solution which will be adapted to local conditions and local demands, be they organic or be they GMO, and we have to consider a continuum between organic and GMO.
So I'd just like to contribute by saying that I think one of the great tragedies of history in this area has been that there's actually been presented as being a complete separation between organic food or organic crops and genetic modification. I think that the objectives of many traits that can be induced through genetic modification are entirely in accordance with organic principles. For example, disease resistance in potato. It's almost impossible to breed late blight resistance into potato, but we can take blight-resistant genes from wild Solanum species and introduce them by genetic modifications, which would dramatically reduce the amount of spraying and the inputs and the sustainability of potato production. Why can't we have a combined, or at least some appreciation that genetic modification can serve the purposes of organic, sustainable production systems actually in a very constructive way?
Well, we're nearing the end of our time here. Before turning this over to our session chair for a wrap-up, I guess I'd like to give all the panel members an opportunity, if there's anything that we haven't covered that they would really like to bring up. Anyone? Okay, we'll turn it over to you, Matthew. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So it's been a very interesting afternoon, I think, from all the panelists up here. I hope you all agree out there. I think one of the main points I'd like to make is really over the next few decades, it's pretty clear the population is going to be growing dramatically. And we must bear in mind that plant science, crop science, takes decades to get through into the marketplace. Discoveries made now, it's going to be 15 to 25 years before they actually really get into a crop in the field, particularly if they are traits affecting the nutrient status, where they will have to go through an approval process and all the rest. And so I think I would say, really, can we take the risk not to continue doing this research with added energy right now if we're going to take care of this in the future? So I'd like to thank once again all our panelists in the usual way. Thank you very much.